Good evening, Ian.
Hello, Deva. Nice to be here.
Thank you very much for your attendance this evening on our first Sapphire Capital podcast. It's a pleasure and honor to have you present here.
Thank you, Deva. It's indeed a privilege. Thank you.
So, just to introduce Ian Chambers, Ian is a tax specialist, also specialized in exchange control and corporate advisory. Ian has emigrated in Mauritius since 2008. He's also written 3 handbooks. The first one is a LexisNexis Financial Advisor Handbook. The second one is a LexisNexis Tax Diary. And the third one is the SARS Practice Manual. Ian also sits on the board of 2 listed companies in Mauritius. Ian, the subject of discussion today, in terms of the topic that we want to address at Sapphire Capital, is a subject of big debate for several years now in terms of exchange control. We know that exchange control still exists in many of those African countries, despite the fact that there are regulated movement of capital in and out of those countries. You still find that there is a lack of currencies and reserves within those countries itself. I know South Africa has strict exchange control with what we call CMA, Common Monetary Area. Ian, maybe you can start by saying to us and by stipulating what is the real history behind exchange control in South Africa?
Sure, Devi. You mentioned in your introduction of exchange controls that exist through Africa, and they're certainly not unique to South Africa. Exchange controls, as the name indicates, is to control the flow of foreign exchange into and out of the country. And the reason why a country needs foreign exchange is in order to conduct international trade. If you don't have the dollars, for lack of a better word, you can't import goods into your country. And a country relies on a foreign exchange to import what I would refer to as strategic items and luxury items and items or goods and services, should I say, that the country is not able to produce. Medicines, food, whatever the case may be. So the introduction of South African exchange control goes back to 1939, when it was introduced to protect or prevent, should I say, a flight of capital following the outbreak of the Second World War. And many countries introduced exchange controls at that time. The difference is South Africa never ever abolished the exchange controls. And in 1961, the new regulations were passed, and they continue to be in effect in part and parcel of the policies of South Africa today. So I would imagine that once a country has introduced exchange control, it's very difficult to abolish exchange control, because there's the fear that while there has been legislation or regulation to prevent the flow of capital outside the country, the fear is amongst the authorities that as soon as the regulations are relaxed or abolished, there will be a flight of capital out the country to a country where exchange controls do not exist. So there has been a natural tendency around the world to invest or hold bank accounts in countries where there is no exchange controls, if that makes sense, Deva.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. So what does that mean in practice for both a South African who wishes to take money outside of South Africa, or out of the CMA as we call it, or wishes to invest outside SA? And secondly, what does that mean for an investor who wants to invest in South Africa?
Dev, in order to answer that question, I think it's important we understand how the exchange control regulation legislative framework operates in South Africa. The South African Reserve Bank, or the Financial Surveillance Division of the South African Reserve Bank, is responsible for the enforcement of the exchange control regulations. It's regulations as opposed to acts of parliament. So therefore, it's governed by the regulations promulgated by the Minister of Finance. So the authority for enforcing that, as I mentioned, with the Financial Surveillance Division of the South African Reserve Bank, and that authority is delegated to what is referred to as authorized dealers. So that's effectively your network of commercial banks in South Africa. So the Reserve Bank has delegated the authority to that and to the authorized dealers, and they provide rulings and issue rulings to their customers in terms of the authority delegated to them. To the extent that they get a request outside the delegation of those authorities, i.e. to invest more than 1 billion rand into African country, that falls outside the authority delegated by the Reserve Bank, and the authorized dealer must then revert back to the South African Reserve Bank in order to get specific authority for that transaction. An applicant may not go directly to the Reserve Bank, or applications for exchange control must be made via the authorized dealer or to the authorized dealer, and to the extent he has the authority, that authorized dealer will be able to issue the ruling. Unfortunately, the Reserve Bank or the policies or the exchange control regulations are generally unknown by the public at large. For instance, you have the Income Tax Act, which is understood and well known by everyone. It's governed by Act of Parliament. This is different to the regulations that are governed by regulations that are not available to the public at large, or to the extent that are available to the public at large are unknown. So there's this general fear of a person being in breach of the exchange control policies unwittingly and unknowingly. So there's this automatic fear of whether they would if they make an application, they would stumble across something that they have unwittingly broken. Now, that goes to the manner in which a South African investor would have to invest offshore. The regulations have been amended back in about 2013, where a South African exchange control resident, being a natural person, may remit up to 1 million rand offshore without any approval whatsoever. Application to their banks to transfer the funds offshore. As soon as the investment is in excess of 1 million rand, they would need clearance from the South African Revenue Service, and because of the lack of revenue, it's no secret that South Africa is way behind the collection of revenues. And as soon as the application is made to the Reserve Bank, there's this fear that it will trigger a tax investigation into the affairs of the applicant, and therefore there's this fear of, by making an offshore investment, would trigger a South African Revenue Service investigation, and that's unhealthy in any economy. From an inward investment point of view, obviously all investment into South Africa needs to be approved by the authorized dealer, and there's something called the Balance of Payments Code, and every investment into South Africa is assigned a number in terms of what the nature of the investment is. Obviously, investing into a country where there is exchange control, or exchange controls, should I say, there's again the unknown. Will I be able to get a return on my investment? Mm-hmm. Or will the dividends that I get in my investment be able to be remitted offshore to me in dollars? Will I be able to realize my investment and realize the investment? Will the dollars or the foreign currency be remittable offshore? So there are these fears from an exchange control point of view, and that inhibits the investment into an economy. So effectively what exchange control unwittingly does is actually does the exact opposite. It prevents the free flow of foreign currency into a country. And I think that's what's happened in Africa. There are the exchange control regulations in place to prevent the outflow of foreign exchange, but it's had the exact opposite effect, that has prevented the free flow of foreign currency into these countries.
I want to talk about the rand quickly. The rand, as we know, has been the subject of quite a few discussions, especially that we see it as a volatile currency. Now, from our reading of the South African economy, rand being volatile, has a direct link with Excon. Now, the recent announcement around abolishing exchange control, is that also linked towards the fact that you want a currency which does not have so much volatility compared to the USD or euros? Is that also a reason why you want the Excon to be abolished completely or relaxed completely?
Yeah,
well, we don't really know where it's going at the moment.
I certainly believe that is one of the drivers for it. Whether it will achieve objective is a completely different question, because I think the stability of a currency is dependent upon the political policies of the governments of their country. And while the abolition of exchange control may lead towards a more stable rand, which is very much a relative term because we've seen violent fluctuations in the level of the rand over the century. And difficult to say whether the abolition of exchange control will lead towards a more stable US dollar rand exchange rate. But I certainly believe that will contribute towards a more stable exchange rate.
Absolutely.
And certainly for the benefit of investors in the country. And obviously, I think one of the fears is, or certainly a concern that an investor has, is that should you invest into the country at 10 Rand to the domestic currency, and because of economic events or policy of the government, the currency then declines to 20 to the foreign currency, you've effectively lost 50% of your investment at the time you invested into the country.
Yes.
And that is the fear. And I think one of the things the South African government needs to pursue are policies to stabilize the rand. As I mentioned, exchange control is merely the abolition of exchange control is merely one of those policies to my mind.
Absolutely. Ian, my next question is around the relationship between Mauritius and South Africa. I mean, we talked about this a few times now. Mauritius has always been an economy or a jurisdiction which has portrayed itself as a financial center, especially for the African continent. And one of the main reasons Mauritius is because we've relaxed or we've abolished exchange control completely. And a lot of driving factor around Mauritius financial center, as you mentioned quite clearly, we talk about inward investments and outward investments out of South Africa, and real exchange control being a major factor around decision making for investors, whether it's external or internal. Mauritius hasn't had that problem. So Mauritius has been quite attractive, especially when we talk about building a war chest, in hard currencies within the African continent. How do you see that relationship now pursuing, given that South Africa really wants to really position itself as a true springboard for Africa? Mauritius, to some extent, is already there. And how do you see that relationship between South Africa and Mauritius playing out?
Deva, as I mentioned earlier, the exchange control is but one factor. And where Mauritius is streaks ahead in South Africa and therefore far more competitive from a South African point of view, or Mauritius is far more competitive than South Africa, are the income tax policies. The fact is that you can earn foreign income, retain it in a US dollar bank account in Mauritius, withdraw that in dollars, transfer that offshore without requiring approval from an authority, and paying 15% on that income and having no withholding taxes. And the final aspect is the ability to fully utilize the foreign taxes withheld on those flow of funds, be it the form of the underlying corporate tax paid by the company declaring the dividends or the withholding taxes, will rank Mauritius far higher than South Africa. What I've certainly seen in the time while I've been in South Africa, or been in Mauritius since 2008, is the establishment of companies by South African investors to invest in the African economy. So what typically has happened is that the South Africans, businessmen, businesswomen, corporates have created parallel structures. A structure for transacting and doing business in South Africa, and a structure for doing business in the rest of the world, which is headquartered in South Africa. Since the fall of apartheid, if I could call it, and the election of the ANC government in 1994, South Africans, for being pariahs to the African continent, have been welcomed into the African continent because of their business acumen and their ability to finance and introduce currency, hard currency, to the African continent. But because of the exchange control policies and the taxation policies of South Africa has not benefited from that. But Mauritius certainly has benefited from that. So we have seen a migration of capital out of South Africa to Mauritius, and we continue to see a migration of capital out of South Africa into Mauritius, and we have seen a migration of businessmen from South Africa taking up residency in Mauritius, being able to obtain permanent residency here by virtue of the policies of the government, and become Mauritian residents and investing into Africa via Mauritius. And I see, until such time that the policies of South Africa mirror those of Mauritius, South Africa will always be behind the curve as far as Mauritius's point of view. You mentioned the blacklist. Blacklist, I was quite surprised when it was introduced. I won't.
What's your view about that EU black? Obviously, we've had our own issues, and Mauritius especially was quite shocked that we got on that blacklist this year. The government is doing and has done a great job with both the FATF and the EU to get removed on the blacklist. We've had our own problems. So how do you see, from a perception perspective, at least, the EU blacklist also playing out?
Deva, I think when the announcement was made that Mauritius would go onto the blacklist, from when the time it went onto the blacklist at the beginning of October, I haven't seen a decrease in economic activity. What the blacklist means is that there's enhanced due diligence. It doesn't prevent the flow of funds. And as you mentioned, Deva, the government Mauritius has always been very compliant as far as the anti-money laundering policies of the task force, and complied with European legislation. They've indicated 5 points where Mauritius has been lacking, and the government is addressing those policies. We've seen new legislation introduced in Mauritius over the past 3-4 months to address the shortcomings. So my view is that while Mauritius is on the blacklist at the moment, I certainly believe by this time next year, certainly before this time next year, Mauritius will be off the blacklist. So, and we will continue to see a flow of investment into Mauritius or into Africa via Mauritius.
Right.
So I don't see that as
you're very positive about
negative.
this.
I'm very,
Absolutely.
very positive. I think it has been addressed, and I think it's just a matter of time until such time that Mauritius is removed from the blacklist.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Ian, obviously we're living in exceptional times, with this COVID virus, has pretty much affected the whole world. Mauritius has not been spared. Our borders, I would say, are still closed to all intent and purposes. Having a 14-day quarantine, still is a big impediment to tourism coming in.
Certainly doesn't stimulate per tourism, yes.
Exactly. So, we had also discussions around this. Obviously, the impact on tourism as a whole has been absolutely disastrous. And it would be good to have your insight on where you see this going. Obviously, tourism is still going to be a huge factor because today it represents more than 30% of our economy as a whole directly, and we can't even measure the indirect effect it has on our economy. But what's your views about how this is playing out from a Mauritian economy perspective, and could it have an effect on the rest of the country as a financial center, as a center of excellence? Be good to have your insight on that.
Deva, I think the first things you mentioned is that COVID is not unique to Mauritius. Mauritius, whatever policy they took to close the borders and seal the country, happened, and it has had, as you mentioned, disastrous effects on the economy. You mentioned that the tourism economy, the tourism comprised of 30%. Is the ancillary businesses that support tourism that's completely unmeasured. And I think the longer the lockdown of the borders continue, the worse the impact will be for Mauritius, because the tourism sector accounts for a big inflow of foreign exchange to Mauritius. And we've spoken about exchange control. We've spoken about the need for foreign currency.
Yes.
Without it, a country cannot import goods, import services. So I think it's vitally important that at some point in time, in the very, very near future, that the economy or the tourism is opened and different measures be taken to deal with the COVID virus. The COVID virus, to my mind, is not going away.
Yes.
And you can't live in fear or isolation or exclusion of the virus. So to my mind, it needs to be addressed head on. Certainly the wearing of masks and social distancing has played its part, and I think certainly helped. But I think there are other available areas in dealing with the COVID. There are certainly blood serum tests that exist that can detect the existence of the virus in a person's bloodstream. And I think one of the aspects that should be undertaken is that as soon as you arrive in Mauritius as a tourist or even as a returning resident or citizen, is that the blood test is done. They have the facilities at the airport, the laboratory facilities, in order to analyze that blood sample. And that is going to give a very fair indication as to whether the person has COVID or not.
Yes.
And that will go, to my mind, go a long way, able to open the economy, kickstart the tourism. I think tourism is one aspect. I think another aspect is the national airline of Mauritius. That needs the tourism sector to survive. The longer planes do not fly, it's like a motor vehicle. The longer you do not drive it, you end up with mechanical failure. You end up with seals of the aircraft not being lubricated. And I think it's essential that the economy be opened and Air Mauritius be able to operate as being the national carrier. We need a national carrier to obviously import goods to us, but to drive the tourism sector. So as long as the tourism sector is not operational and is closed effectively, the national airline suffers.
Yes. But I would argue as well that, one of the things that the government has done exceptionally well is manage the COVID situation in Mauritius. I mean, if you look at today, UK went into lockdown again, which is absolutely disastrous, for the UK economy. Mauritius today, we are quite fortunate that we have a government that has managed this very, very efficiently. We still have what we call semi-closed borders, as we say. And it's always a situation of what do you prioritize more, the health situation of the country or the economy, and try and balance the two. And it's always a difficult decision. I think no decision will always be regarded as the right decision. So the government has a very, very tough job.
It's a very, very difficult balancing act.
Exactly.
And I think it's the managing. I think what is important is balancing health, which is vitally important. We've spoken about the second lockdown that's happened in the UK on Thursday, and ensuring that your economy stays alive. As I mentioned, COVID's not going away at any time soon, to my mind. So
unless we get a vaccine.
And there's no guarantee that vaccine will be successful. So I think to my mind, it's the policy should be living with COVID.
Absolutely. Ian, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you. And again, thank you for your time. And it's been lovely to have your insights on South Africa, on XCon. And we wish you well.
Thank you, Deva. It's always a pleasure chatting to you. Thank you.
All the best.